Going back, James Whale is one of my favorites because he had a lot of gallows humor and dark humor in his films, and Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man. He was one of those people who really studied the dark side of the psyche. It's so much of his quote monsters are just souls that were denied love and became or denied self-expression, and because of that became monsters. I love James Whale. Old Dark House, love it. The humor in that is just great. Later on, I'm a big fan of William Castle. Big fan of his showmanship and his P.T. Barnum aspects. Love Terence Fisher for the gothic British, fix that I love. Growing up, I was obsessed with Hammer films, and Terrence's are my favorite. Roger Corman, the Edgar Allan Poes, and then later on in the the 70s, I love. The 60s. The Italian Mario Bava. Adore his style. Adore how he paints with color. And then growing up, my contemporary heroes, were John Carpenter, and John Landis is just my hero, my mentor. And it's interesting because, master of horror, but really when you think about it, Thriller, Innocent Blood, American Way, really they're horror comedies. Like, he's never just made a straight-ahead horror film, But still, he's great at scaring the hell out of you.
And I said to him on Saturday, I think nobody's made a better werewolf film than American Werewolf in London. To me, it's still the ultimate werewolf film.
Absolutely.
And it's still the ending. I still tear up at the ending. It's such an emotional punch.
It is. It's a perfect film, and it's a unique film. And you go back and it's a film that never feels old or tired. It's so refreshing. At its time, so many of the things that have been done that it did have been done since, but it was done first. The idea of having pop rock and roll, classic rock and roll accompany, scenes of horror, setting them in bright daylight versus the darkness. The idea of the old world and the new world, which is something that's very British, very European. In America, we're only a couple hundred years old. There's no, you don't see the modern London Eye next to Westminster Abbey. That just blows my mind. I did this little tour of London yesterday, and just. People just don't really the fact that the legends of the old walk side by side. Jack the Ripper walks side by side with the London businessman. It's there, and that's what I loved about American Werewolf. From the locals sitting around in that slaughtered lamb to the modern nurse played by Jenny Agutter. I love that film. It's tops on my list. That's why it's such an honor to have John Landis sort of championing me and my films, But other directors, Tobe Hooper. I think one of the other great neglected vampire films is Salem's Lot, the film he did, which I think is the scariest film ever made for TV. I'm a huge Rob Zombie fan. I love Rob Zombie. I love Devil's Rejects. I think Devil's Rejects is, a nod to the sort of Badlands, on the 70s couple on the road in the Midwest type of film. Heartland horror. Heartland horror is what Rob does. Rob also has a great way of finding the sort of humanity within the most despicable characters, which I really like. Peter Medic's Changeling. That's the only horror film he's done, but it's one of my favorite horror films ever. Ghost films. So I have favorites throughout the sort of decades, but those are among the tops.
All right. Speaking like working with Robert Englund on the first film.
Dream come true. You grow up being, sincerely frightened by Robert Englund in the first Nightmare on Elm Street, and Freddy's a rock star. Robert's a rock star. My God, he was a guest VJ on MTV. He was. At the time, the directors were more, and the special effects guys were more the stars of the splatter films than the actors. You know, Jamie Lee Curtis may have been famous, but she wasn't the villain. So Robert was the first guy to come along since maybe Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, who was a real bona fide horror icon. And, you know, anybody making a horror film just was like, well, I'm going to get, you know, you're going to put Robert Englund in it. And I was lucky enough to have worked at New Line Cinema, you know, during the 90s, 80s and 90s, and, you know, we became friends. We would always see each other at the New Line Christmas parties and the New Line functions, and we really bonded over our mutual love of horror films. He's an encyclopedia, not just horror, but anything, any subject, I'm convinced. Like, he could go on that show in Slumdog Millionaire and beat that kid. You know, he could. He's just a reservoir of knowledge. So, you know, when the opportunity came to remake the films of Herschel Gordon Lewis, you know, that landed in my lap, and I picked 2000 Maniacs because I liked that story. I just love the whole, you know, Brigadoon reference, and I went to Robert. I said, Robert, I'm going to remake 2000 Maniacs. Would you be Mayor Buckman? And he said, if you do it like a vaudeville, a burlesque, a hee-haw on acid was the exact thing he said, hee-haw on acid. And I came up with the term, well, you mean like a splat stick, like a, you know, slapstick but with splat. He goes, that's it. And he was hooked. And based on his saying yes, you know, I wrote the script like I was on fire, and I just envisioned him. You know, I wrote it for him. I knew Lynn Shea I had worked with on Detroit Rock City, so I once, you know, her, Granny, and him, and you know, once he was involved, that's how the movie got made. It was fantastic, and he really set this, you know, the mold for Mayor Buckman.